In the year 1219, a governor on the edge of a Persian empire made a decision that would end his entire civilization. A Mongol trade caravan crossed into his territory. He had every member of it executed, along with the ambassadors sent afterward to demand an explanation. To him, they were just steppe nomads, not worth taking seriously. That assumption would cost him everything. Within a few years, his empire, one of the wealthiest and most powerful in the Islamic world, no longer existed. The man he'd insulted was Genghis Khan, and by the time his armies were finished, an empire spanning from the Sea of Japan to the Mediterranean would rise out of the ashes of everyone who underestimated him. For over 150 years, the empire he built didn't lose a single major war. Not one. So how does an army of horsemen from the Mongolian steppe end up conquering more territory than Rome ever did, without ever really being beaten? It starts with a boy named Temujin, born around 1160 to near Lake Baikal. Into a world that had no reason to expect anything from him, his clan was poor and fractured. His early years were marked by betrayal, including abandonment by his own tribe after his father's death. Most people in his position would have simply survived if they were lucky. Temujin did something else. He spent years building alliances, defeating rival clans, and slowly consolidating the fractured, constantly warring tribes of Mongolia into a single, unified force. In 1206, the tribes formally recognized him under a new title, Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler. For the first time in Mongolian history, there was one Mongolia, not 100 competing ones. But unification alone doesn't explain the conquests that followed. What made Genghis Khan's army different wasn't just size. It was structure. He built his forces on merit instead of bloodline, meaning a skilled commoner could rise to command troops, while a noble who failed could be demoted or executed. Discipline was absolute. Insubordination wasn't punished with a warning, it was punished with death. That created something rare for the era. An army where every soldier trusted the man next to him completely because loyalty and competence, not birthright, decided who led. Then there was the actual fighting style, which genuinely broke the rules of medieval warfare. Mongol armies were built around light cavalry, horse archers trained from childhood, capable of firing accurately while riding at full speed. Instead of charging in for a decisive clash the way most armies did, they stayed at range, circling, raining arrows down, and retreating the moment the enemy tried to close the distance. And here's the part that wrecked entire armies who didn't understand it. The retreat was often fake. Mongol riders would flee in apparent panic, drawing the enemy into a chase, only to turn in the saddle and fire backward at full gallop, a maneuver so effective it's still studied today. Enemy formations would break apart chasing what they thought was a beaten army, and by the time they realized their mistake, they were surrounded. Then there was the psychological side, which honestly might be the most brutal part of the whole strategy. When a city resisted, the consequences were made deliberately, horrifically visible, and survivors were often allowed to flee and tell others what they'd witnessed. That wasn't cruelty without purpose. It was calculated. Word would spread ahead of the army faster than the army itself could travel. And by the time Mongol forces reached the next city, many simply surrendered without a fight, because the alternative had already been demonstrated somewhere else. And here's what really separates Genghis Khan from most conquerors of his era. He didn't just win with what he already had. He adapted constantly. When Mongol forces encountered walled cities they couldn't outride or outshoot, they brought in Chinese engineers and adopted siege technology. Catapults, trebuchets, battering rams turning nomadic horsemen into an army capable of breaking down the wilds of the most fortified cities in Asia. Later, they'd use the very techniques they learned from one conquered civilization against the next one. Muslim siege tactics turned against Chinese cities. Chinese weaponry turned against Islamic armies. The empire kept absorbing the best ideas of everyone it defeated, then turning those ideas into the next conquest. By the time Genghis Khan died in 1227, the empire stretched from the Yellow Sea to the Caspian, and it was still growing. Under his successors, it would eventually become the largest contiguous land empire in recorded history, at its peak commanding more than 1 million men across a territory so vast that a messenger could theoretically ride from one end to the other for months without leaving Mongol-controlled land. So what actually made this war machine unbeatable for a century and a half? It wasn't numbers. Most of the empires the Mongols defeated had larger populations and bigger standing armies. It was mobility over mass, discipline over hierarchy, terror as strategy rather than accident, and the willingness to learn from every enemy instead of underestimating them the way that one Persian governor underestimated a simple trade caravan. He thought he was dealing with nomads. He was actually dealing with the beginning of the largest empire the world had ever seen.